Alla Tulia Meldonia Ahara Mariese. I am Rainbow Dave and welcome to our fourth video, Untangling the Tale of Fëanor and the Silmarils. So, in the last episode we saw the first ever murder in the history of Arda. The High King Finwë has been slain by the Dark Lord Melkor. And that's not all, because Melkor and the monstrous creature Ungoliant have also destroyed the two great trees of Valinor that light the west, and so they have plunged all of the Blessed Realm into darkness. But despite those two atrocities, the crime that'll see the greatest repercussions is the theft of the Silmarils, the divine jewels forged by the elven smith Fëanor. Now, as we saw last time, Melkor and Ungoliant have fled from Valinor north across the sea and all the way into the eastern continent of Middle-earth. And that is where we're going to pick up right now. So, it's been a very long time since Melkor was last in Middle-earth. 3 long ages, to be specific. And way back in the beginning, during the ages of Starlight and the war for the sake of the elves, Melkor's evil citadel, his fortress, was the dark pit of Utumno. But Utumno is destroyed. In the Battle of the Powers, remember, it was rent open by the Valar and utterly demolished. So there's not much chance of Melkor going back there. In fact, if we look at the map, we can see that in the northeast where Utumno once stood, there is nothing. You see, the Valar used so much power and devastated the land so much whilst capturing Melkor that this part of the world is left forever a barren wasteland. But if you were really paying attention back in the Awakening of the Elves video, you may remember that Utumno was not Melkor's only evil citadel. You see, to the west of Utumno lie the Ered Engreen, or the Iron Mountains. Now within these mountains, or I guess more accurately, beneath them, is Melkor's second fortress, the Iron Prison of Angband. And despite Melkor's absence, Angband has not fallen into ruin. You see, during the war for the sake of the elves, the Valar were so eager and so determined to overthrow Melkor and take him prisoner that they just sort of glossed over Angband, and they didn't really spend that much time truly ridding it of the evil that still dwells there. So now that evil has multiplied, and in Melkor's absence, his most trusted servant now rules, awaiting the Dark Lord's return. And this most trusted servant is, of course, the Black Sorcerer, Sauron. Now, during Melkor's imprisonment, Sauron has been a busy little bee, and in the pits beneath Angband, whole new legions of orcs have been bred to do their master's bidding. And it isn't just orcs that await the Dark Lord's return. In a state of almost hibernation, 7 Balrogs bide their time deep within the earth, knowing that the time will soon come when their master will summon them once more. Now, I should just say that I talk about 7 Balrogs, but Tolkien never in the Silmarillion gives us an exact number of how many Balrogs there are, and actually in the Book of Lost Tales, which was written, decades before, during World War I, Tolkien implies that there are thousands of Balrogs, but the Balrogs of his earliest writings are very different from the Balrogs that we see in the Silmarillion and obviously in The Lord of the Rings. And there's actually a little note in the margin of one of Tolkien's many writings in which he says something along the lines of, there could be no more than 7. So that's what I choose to believe. I believe there are 7 Balrogs, including their chief, Gothmog. Anyway, speaking of the Balrog's master, the last time we saw Melkor, he had just crossed the treacherous Helcaraxe. And now, for the first time in millennia, he's back in Middle-earth. But Melkor spends very little time reveling in his new domain, because he knows he's going to need an army if he truly wants to reclaim dominion over the whole continent. So, he decides to head north towards, you guessed it, Angband. But this is where Ungoliant demonstrates just how powerful the light of Valinor has made her. You see, she knows that if Melkor makes it to Angband, he'll be free of her, and he'll take the Silmarils with him. And it's the Silmarils that Ungoliant still really hungers after. So, she straight up demands them. But it probably won't come as a surprise that Melkor never actually intended to share these jewels with anyone, and there's absolutely no way he's going to let Ungoliant devour them. So, Melkor refuses. And this is when Ungoliant attacks. Now, back when we first met her, back in Avatar, there is no way Ungoliant could ever have vanquished Melkor. I mean, she's a ginormous primeval spirit, don't get me wrong, but Melkor is a Valar, and he is the mightiest of the Valar at that. But times have changed since then. Thanks to the light of the trees that Ungoliant has devoured, she is now huge, and imbued with strength that she's never before possessed. And on the other end of the scale, Melkor is now severely weakened. For throughout his entire crossing from Valinor to Middle-earth, he's been holding on to the Silmarils. And they have been burning his hand and sapping his strength this whole time. Also, Melkor is now bound to one corporeal body, so if that body dies, he's screwed. So, what I'm basically saying is that the scales have now tipped in Ungoliant's favor. So, Ungoliant rises up against Melkor, and she uses her webs of unlight to try and strangle the life from him. Now, as she does this, Melkor screams in anguish, and his scream is so loud and so terrible that the mountains shake and the earth trembles, and forever after, this place is known as the Land of the Great Echo. In fact, the scream of Melkor is said to be the most dreadful sound ever heard in all of Middle-earth. But this scream does serve a purpose. You see, in forgotten catacombs far beneath the earth, Melkor's oldest servants slumber. For thousands of years they have waited, but now their master's cry awakens them. And for the first time in millennia, the Balrogs arise. And in a tempest of fire, they come to their master's aid. Now, the Lord of the Balrogs is called Gothmog, and he is among the Dark Lord's mightiest servants. In fact, the only other person on Gothmog's level is Sauron. And I've always thought that this fight is one of the most kick-ass moments of any story ever. So, with Gothmog at their head, 7 Balrogs descend on Ungoliant, and with whips of flame they burn away her webs of unlight. And the might of their flame is so great that they force Ungoliant off Melkor and they badly injure her. Now, Ungoliant is forced to flee into the south, and as she goes, she belches these black vapors to cover her escape. Now, the Balrogs are ready to hunt her down, but Melkor holds them back. You see, he has the Silmarils. Ungoliant has served her purpose. And now Melkor's priority is rebuilding Angband and the army that awaits him inside. So, mercifully for, well, literally every living person in this story, this is where Ungoliant's part of the tale comes to an end. She fled over a mountain range called the Ered Gorgoroth, which means the Mountains of Terror. and she eventually came to dwell in a valley called Nandun Gortheb, which translates as the Valley of Dreadful Death. So, as you can probably guess, Ungoliant is the reason why these places have such an awful reputation. But it's not actually her that causes this dreadful death. No, instead, it's her children. For in Nandun Gortheb, Ungoliant breeds with the other monstrous spiders of this region. And when she's done breeding, she devours her mates. And so, before long, all of Ungoliant's hideous offspring come to poison and defile this land. And this is actually the origin of the giant spiders that we see a few times in the Legendarium. Now, I bet you guys are all familiar with that scene in The Hobbit, when Bilbo and Thorin and the dwarves are all attacked by giant spiders in Mirkwood. And as it goes, these giant spiders in Mirkwood are actually the distant descendants of Ungoliant. However, I reckon by far Ungoliant's most famous child is her last surviving daughter. Not descendant, daughter. And her name is, of course, Shelob. Now, as I'm sure everyone here knows, Shelob will one day inhabit the pass of Cirith Ungol, where she will poison the ring-bearer Frodo Baggins before being vanquished by his gardener, Samwise Gamgee.
Let him go, you filth.
But, interestingly, it's here, in Nandun Gortheb, that Shelob's life begins. Now, there is a fun little detail here, because in the 17th chapter of The Two Towers, The Forbidden Pool, Frodo is talking to Faramir, and they're talking about Cirith Ungol, and Faramir is warning Frodo not to go there. So Frodo asks, "What do you know against this place that makes its name so dreadful?" And Faramir's response is, "Nothing certain." But Cirith Ungol is Sindarin for the pass of the spider. Like, Ungol comes from Ungoliant. And 2 chapters earlier, Faramir was speaking in Sindarin to his friends, the Rangers. So, how could he not guess that there might be some kind of giant spider living in the pass of the spider? I just don't get it. Engage your brain, Faramir. No, that's not fair. Faramir is a great character. He's an awesome dude. I take that back. But it is a interesting little discrepancy. But anyway, just before we say goodbye to Ungoliant, I want to take one last moment to finish her story. Because after spawning Shelob and various others, Ungoliant herself actually disappears from the annals of history. And no one in Middle-earth really knows for certain what became of her. But Tolkien implies that she may have ultimately perished at her own hand. So, Tolkien wrote one of his famous "Some Say," and I guess this means that it's up to the reader, it's up to us to decide whether this is canon, or whether it's the truth, or whether it's just a kind of legend within Middle-earth. But anyway, Tolkien wrote that some say, in her eternal hunger, Ungoliant eventually devoured even herself, and with that, she returned to the void from whence she had come. Now, as I've said, I don't know for sure if that's true, but I really like it, and I think it's a really fitting end to Ungoliant's story. Like, remember, she was defined by gluttony, and ultimately, if you believe what some say, she was consumed by it. But anyway, that's what Melkor and Ungoliant have been up to in Middle-earth. But on the other side of the sea, back in Valinor, things have just become very dramatic for the Noldor. So, when Fëanor discovered that his father had been murdered and his Silmarils are stolen, something really snaps inside him. Like, as soon as he learns what Melkor's done, Fëanor becomes mad with rage and grief. And he curses Melkor. In fact, he actually names Melkor the Black Foe of the World, which translates into the Elven tongue as Morgoth.
A Balrog of Morgoth.
And this is how Melkor is forever afterwards known, and his enemies never actually use his true name ever again. So, from now on, for the rest of the story, I will also refer to Melkor as Morgoth, because that's exactly how all the characters would have referred to him, and it's also how Tolkien refers to him from this point on. Anyway, while the Vanya elves, and presumably most of the Maiar, are weeping in the dark, Fëanor immediately races back to the Noldorin city of Tirion, and he brings all 7 of his sons with him. Now, I'm sure if you saw the last episode, you'll remember that Fëanor is technically still banished from Tirion by the Valar, and a lot of the Noldor remember this too. You see, the Noldor are in a weird position now. When it comes to their king, the only High King they've ever all agreed on was Finwë, but he's dead, which means the throne could now pass to either Fëanor or his half-brother Finwë. And this is the first time that we really see a significant divide forming amongst the Noldor. On the one hand, there's Fëanor's more radical faction, and these guys desperately want to leave Valinor, travel east, and go to war with Morgoth to A, avenge Finwë, but B, mostly to take back the Silmarils. And this faction all considers Fëanor the rightful king. And to be fair, Fëanor does have a very strong claim to the throne. If you remember from last episode, Fingolfin actually yielded his crown to Fëanor, and he did recognize Fëanor as the eldest son and the true leader of their people. So, Fëanor came to the high court of the king, and in front of almost all of the Noldor, he delivered a really impassioned speech, where he incited his people to rise up against the Valar. Now, remember, even giving this speech is in and of itself an act of rebellion, because, once again, Fëanor is still banished from Tirion by the Valar, and yet here he is. But the Noldor do listen, and that is because Fëanor is a master of words. But what's interesting is that although Fëanor absolutely hates Morgoth for all that he's done, he does still kind of buy in to Morgoth's lies about the Valar being the real enemy. So, he directs a lot of his anger at them. And in the red glow of many torches, he asks why should they serve these jealous gods, who cannot keep their own realm secure from the enemy? And was Morgoth not one of their kin in the first place? Fëanor says that vengeance calls him to Middle-earth, but even if that weren't so, he refuses to spend any more time in Aman as a slave of the Valar. Now, obviously it goes without saying, Fëanor is in absolutely no sense of the word a slave, but he believes that he is. And I think after Finwë was murdered and the Silmarils were stolen, Fëanor's sanity is really slipping away like there's no tomorrow. Anyway, he talks to the Noldor all about these fertile lands that await them in Middle-earth, and all the great elven kingdoms they could build and rule over. He urges the Noldor to follow him east, away from the Undying Lands, away from Valinor, and across the sea to Middle-earth. But he tells them to pack light, for they have a long journey ahead of them. They are not to take unnecessary treasures, but they are to take their swords. For they will travel further than Orome and endure longer than Tulkas. And when they're done, they will seize the Silmarils from Morgoth's dead hands and live forever in Middle-earth as masters of their own bliss. So when he's finished saying all this, Fëanor draws his own sword and he begins to swear an oath. And this oath is going to be hugely important in the shaping of the entire First Age. And the other thing that is hugely important is that all 7 of Fëanor's sons stand at his side, draw their swords, and also swear the exact same oath. Now, while doing so, Fëanor and his sons invoke the name of Eru Ilúvatar himself. And remember, Eru Ilúvatar is the equivalent of capital G, God, as in the One, the creator of the entire universe. So, by invoking his name, this oath becomes everlasting and entirely unbreakable. In fact, it's said that the oath will pursue both the Oathbreaker and the Oathkeeper to the very world's end. And just in case it's not already heavy enough, Fëanor also calls upon Manwë and Varda to witness the oath from their thrones atop Taniquetil. So, this isn't just some kind of flippant agreement among friends, this is a cosmically binding oath that will have massive repercussions to follow. And I do just really want to take a quick moment to hammer this home and talk about the significance of oaths in Tolkien's Legendarium. Because although this is the first one chronologically, it certainly isn't the last. Remember in Return of the King, when Aragorn summons the Army of the Dead? Well, the whole point of the Army of the Dead is that they swore an oath to fight for the King of Gondor in the War of the Last Alliance, and they invoked the name of Eru Ilúvatar to do it. So when of course the men of Dun Harrow broke their oath, and they refused to fight with Isildur against Sauron, they became oath breakers, and they were cursed for it. Eru Ilúvatar literally will not release their souls until their oath is done. Like, they're dead, their bodies are dead, but their spirits cannot move on. So that's just kind of an insight into how seriously oaths are taken in this world. But anyway, what's this oath all about? Well, good question. Fëanor and his sons all swear that they will pursue the Silmarils to the ends of the world, and they will kill anyone, and I mean absolutely anyone, good or evil, that would try to keep a Silmaril from them. So, remember this, alright? Burn this into your brains. Fëanor, along with his 7 sons, Maedhros the Tall, Maglor the Mighty Singer, Celagorm the Fair, Caranthea the Dark, Curufin the Crafty, and the twin hunters Amrod and Amras all make this binding oath. And they are now all eternally bound to the fate of the Silmarils. And there can be no going back from this. Not ever. So, if you're thinking this whole oath thing is pretty extreme, you're certainly not the only one. There's a whole host of Noldor who are still loyal to Fingolfin, and although he's not technically king anymore, he is certainly still the leader in their eyes. So this crazy oath is incredibly divisive, and most of the Noldor are really disturbed by it. And in the royal family, these divisions are most clear. Now, Fingolfin, he does the responsible thing here. He challenges Fëanor, he rebukes him. But, surprisingly, Fëanor does not appreciate this, and the two brothers almost come to blows. In fact, we're told the only reason that violence is averted is due to the intervention of the third brother, Finarfin. So, if you remember, Finarfin is the youngest son of Finwë and Indis, and he's also considered the wisest and certainly the most peaceful of the Noldor's princes. Now, Finarfin counsels that both his brothers Fëanor and Fingolfin need to pause and ponder before they do anything they're going to regret, as Finarfin foresees only disaster and death in rebelling against the Valar and journeying to Middle-earth. Now, at this point in the Silmarillion, Tolkien goes into loads of detail about what pretty much every member of the royal family thinks of this, and I could spend the next 45 minutes talking you through all of it, but I'm not going to. Because going forward with the story, what you really need to know is that 3 factions form amongst the Noldor. There's a small group of radicals led by Fëanor, a much larger group of more reasonable elves led by Fingolfin, and a third group of pacifists led by Finarfin. Now, I find it really interesting that Fëanor's own wife and the mother of his sons, Nedanel, is very much not on his side. In fact, Nedanel begs him to reconsider his rebellion, and she asks Fëanor to remain in Valinor and try to find peace. However, as you know, this is now impossible. The oath has been made, and there's no power in all of Arda that can take it back. So all Nedanel can do is ask that at least her youngest sons, at least Amrod and Amaras, be left in peace with her. But Fëanor refuses. He says that they too made the oath, and Nedanel must either follow him and their sons all the way to Middle-earth, or abandon them all. Now, I can't imagine how difficult this choice must have been for Nedanel, but in the end, she decides that she can just no longer love her husband, and the time has come that they must part ways. However, just before Nedanel leaves Fëanor for good, she warns him that one of their sons will never set foot on Middle-earth, and those that do will never return. So, Nedanel refuses to make the journey, and she remains in Valinor with her good friend Indis. For Indis is one of the Vanya, remember, not one of the Noldor. And although she loves her sons very much, Fingolfin and Finarfin, she can't justify betraying the Valar for the Noldor's pride. And similarly, both Fingolfin's wife and Finarfin's wife also refuse to leave Valinor. And I find this really interesting that the women all seem to demonstrate this wisdom and humility that many, if not most, of the men in their family seem to lack. And so when people say, there's not many women in Tolkien's works, the reason for that is because many of the wisest and most powerful women understand that it's better to live in peace with gods than to throw it all away in the pursuit of vengeance. But there is one exception. Because as we all know, Galadriel does make the journey to Middle-earth. Now, although Galadriel's relationship with her uncle has dramatically soured since the beginning, she's not totally lost sight of her ambition, and she still yearns to rule a realm of her own in Middle-earth. And this means that Galadriel stands alone as the only woman of the Noldor who agrees with Fëanor, and she actually joins him in his most radical faction. So, the Noldor march out of Tirion, led by one of their three princes. And for the Valar, this really sucks, but there's nothing they can do. The elves were given free will by Eru Ilúvatar, and that goes way beyond the Valar's jurisdiction. But Manwë, he does at least try to dissuade Fëanor. And so, just as Fëanor begins to depart, he encounters a messenger of Manwë who basically says, "Do not leave the Blessed Realm, you absolute fool! There is nothing in Middle-earth but death and darkness." But to this, Fëanor responds basically, "Shut up, I'm gonna go anyway." And thus, most of the Noldor begin their long journey east, away from paradise and towards Middle-earth. Now, that is where we're going to leave the Noldor for this episode, for they have a very long and tumultuous road ahead. But just before we finish this video entirely, I do want to just jump back across the sea one more time to check in on Melkor, or I guess now Morgoth. So, Morgoth pretty much has everything he wants, and he decides that Angband will be his seat of power during his conquest of Middle-earth. And so he gathered all the slag and rubble and debris that had been delved by the endless tunneling beneath the fortress, and he uses it to raise up 3 great volcanic peaks to loom over Angband. Now these mountains of fire are known collectively as the Thangarodrim, and they are the highest peaks in Middle-earth. Now Morgoth also forges for himself a great iron crown, and into this crown he sets the 3 Silmarils. And for hundreds of years to come, Morgoth will wear this crown with these jewels proudly as a symbol of his dominion. But there is a catch. Now, I know I mentioned this earlier, but Morgoth is now bound to his one body. And this is a big deal. Like, despite Morgoth's power and strength and size, he is now finite. Like, if someone were to say, cut off his head, he would die. Just imagine that. Imagine being an immortal god who suddenly finds himself mortal. Death, all of a sudden, becomes a reality. And this only makes the Dark Lord more dangerous. And I'm afraid that is it for another episode. But to make sure you don't miss next week's episode, go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Now, I know this episode's run on a little bit longer than usual, but I do have a very quick little Tolkien fun fact for you all. So this week's fun fact is another one about Professor Tolkien himself. Did you know that before becoming a professor of Anglo-Saxon studies, Tolkien actually spent a little bit of time working at the Oxford English Dictionary? And Tolkien is actually responsible for writing entries for quite a few words towards the beginning of the letter W. In fact, most of the words between waggle and warlock bear some of Tolkien's philological knowledge, including walnut, walrus, and wampum. All words with particularly challenging etymologies. So next time you crack open a dictionary, just think that a small part of it was constructed by Tolkien himself. In fact, true to form, Tolkien continued to study the etymology of these words long after he left the OED. And my personal favourite word that Tolkien worked on is waistcoat, because he is later remembered for wearing a waistcoat so iconically. Although actually, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the technically correct way to pronounce this word, or the way Tolkien would have pronounced it, is actually waistcoat. And it's only recently, as the garment has become less popular in everyday outfits, that we've changed this pronunciation to waistcoat. But anyway, thank you all very much for watching, and until next time, dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Navaya Melanin.